All right, now we're going to turn to talk about anxiety, and in much more detail, we'll talk about stress. So, I want to mention anxiety just because I think your book talks about it in relatively narrow terms. So, when your book talks about anxiety, it's talking specifically about an increase in the startle reflex, which is one aspect of the physiological experience of anxiety, but that definition is a little bit narrow. And a lot of other research that looks at anxiety thinks about it in a broader way that has a lot of different components because we know things are rarely as simple as just an increase in the startle reflex. That is a very narrow way of thinking about this, and we've gotten used to complex terms in this class, I think. So anxiety might have different components. An affective component, that you feel negative sort of affective reactions, you feel apprehensive, distressed, feel some unease. Cognitive component, that you might be worried. You might be expecting negative outcomes, expecting more negative affect. And you might have physiological components that your blood pressures increase, more cortisol, more sweat, these stress hormones and the reactions to that. So this all might be part of the experience of anxiety for people. And like I kind of alluded to already, these things can reinforce one another. So worrying about feeling bad might make you feel bad more, which might make you worried more about feeling bad, which might make you physiologically feel worse. So these things can all reciprocally man, reciprocally reinforce one another. So I just wanted to mention that anxiety in a lot of people's way of thinking about it is much more complex than your book seems to treat it. And anxiety, in a lot of ways, is people's specific response to different types of stressors, which we're going to talk about now. So, what is stress exactly that might lead us sometimes to feel anxiety? So, kind of a textbook definition of stress, it's a negative emotional experience accompanied by predictable biochemical, physiological, cognitive, and behavioral changes that are directed either toward altering the stressful event or accommodating to its effects. So, this alludes to this sort of source of stress, some kind of event that is leading you and your body to engage in these sorts of changes and behaviors to deal with that stressful event. And there are lots of different types of stressors or stressful events. And we might think about them along two dimensions: physical and psychological, and chronic and acute. So physical stressors, things that are not going to be unique to humans, things that all animals might find stressful. If you are hungry, if you're cold, if you are wet, if you are in pain, if you're tired, if you are being threatened by some other animal, like some kind of predator, these are all examples of physical stressors that you might want to avoid. Psychological stressors, on the other hand, are things that are stressful for humans only, essentially. So, worrying about your grades, worrying about your job security, worrying about having enough money, worried about being stuck in traffic. These things are psychological stressors that might call for some sort of solution. So, the other dimension that I brought up, acute versus chronic, these are not exactly the same or not the same at all as physical and psychological, although there does tend to be a relationship that physical stressors are more likely to be acute, psychological stressors are more likely to be chronic, although there are acute psychological and chronic physical stressors, of course, like chronic pain would be an example of a chronic physical stressor, although there might also be a psychological component to that, or acute psychological stressors might be things that you're worried about very briefly. But acute, again, sudden things that are quick. They require you to find a solution immediately. They're not things that are involved in like long-term planning and goals. It's like you need to solve these right now. So again, most physical stressors tend to be acute, but not all of them. Most psychological stressors, as I mentioned, are chronic. So the things I mentioned, like worrying about your job security, or getting a good grade, or finding a good job, or holding on to your romantic partner, all these things might be chronic types of stressors that are leading you to worry over time. So we might think then about acute physical stressors separately, of course, from chronic psychological stressors, but in part because uh, our stress reactions, the way we physiologically and psychologically react to stressors, is not adapted to chronic psychological stressors. In our evolutionary history, um, for most of that period, we were only really experiencing acute physical types of stressors. So that is what we are adapted to deal with. These chronic psychological stressors are things that have only cropped up in the last several hundred years, or maybe even a couple thousand years. So these chronic psychological stressors are not things that our bodies, our genes, have yet been selected for. We have not evolved to deal with chronic psychological stressors. So, our stress response in general, we can think about it in a few different ways. I've mentioned already the kind of arousal that comes from our autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system becomes activated, that fight or flight response happens. You have release of different types of chemicals that are going to get you amped up and able to deal with whatever problem that you have. And your parasympathetic nervous system might be kind of inactivated, so you're not doing any of those calming, sort of long-term types of activities. You also find that this hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, or much easier, the HPA axis, is activated as part of that sympathetic nervous system response, and that releases corticosteroids like cortisol, other things that are going to be involved in kind of getting your body ready to deal with problems. So we do have slightly different types of responses that have to do with how much you have available to deal with things, basically. So if the demands that you are facing are outweighing the resources that you have, then you might just have this autonomic response. But if there's some kind of challenge that is like, maybe kind of exciting, something kind of almost, I might even say, like fun to deal with, that is a stressor, but also something that is interesting to engage in, that might be more like a challenge, where that HPA response is going to be more likely to be engaged as well. So just to point out that not all stressors are uniformly bad. Sometimes we might use some stress as like a motivator for things that challenge us or kind of excite us in a way. But over time, what is stress doing to your body? In the short term, stress is very useful. It gives you energy. Its main thing, with that autonomic nervous system going, is to let you be strong enough, be fast enough, be alert enough to deal with problems in your immediate vicinity. And if there's something happening, like if you get injured when you're trying to escape something, or you're engaging in some kind of physical confrontation, it makes it so you don't notice pain as much either, which in the short term might be useful because you might be able to focus on accomplishing your task better. But stress also does all of these other things. Raise your heart rate and blood pressure. This is useful in the moment to get you moving, slowing down all these things like digestion, growth, and reproduction. Again, it shuts down that parasympathetic activation, because if you're going to die soon, you don't need to digest or grow or reproduce. You don't need to do those things. So why waste that energy on that if we don't know if we're going to survive? Let's put all of our energy towards surviving, and we'll deal with those other things later. Stress also speeds aging and suppresses your immune system. Again, you don't need to fight off infections if you're going to get killed by someone or smashed by something in the very near future. So another one of those kind of shutting down the parasympathetic sorts of things. All these things, though, have negative outcomes if you're stressed all the time. So heart rate and blood pressure goes up, you're going to have a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. Slower digestion, you might have colitis, ulcers, bowel problems. If you have really pronounced stress early in life, you might have problems with your growth and development, like stress dwarfism. If you have your reproduction slowed down all the time, you might have reproductive problems like becoming impotent, not having libido, having problems with ovulation, or even losing a fetus. If your pain is blunted, then it's possible your injuries will get worse because you're not noticing that they're getting worse. And aging can speed up too, perhaps because of this, the way that stress impacts your genes. So on that last slide, I said it shortens telomeres, and useful metaphor to kind of explain what telomeres are. And you know what? I've heard people say it both ways. I always say telomeres because it sounds more like a plural object to me, but I have heard people say telomerase. I think that's maybe not right, but I'm not 100% confident on that. Anyway, so I always ask this in class. There's always somebody that knows what these are, but if you know what they are, feel satisfied with yourself that you know that these things on the ends of shoelaces are called aglets. And I bring this up because your chromosomes kind of have aglets. Your chromosomes are your very tightly wound kind of code for your body. Your DNA, those double helixes that have all your genetic code are wound up in these chromosomes. All of your cells have your 23 pairs of chromosomes in them, and these telomeres on your chromosomes are kind of keeping them together. And when your telomeres are shortened, this is a way that we seem to age. And it's kind of complicated. It seems like telomeres are both a sign of aging, that if they're shorter, you are older, but they also can cause, it seems, premature biological aging if they have become shortened. So this seems to be an issue that more stress over a period of time, over a long period of time, is going to shorten these telomeres. One study that looked at, again, this is a correlational study, so it's not like we can randomly assign people to chronic stress. So this is the only type of evidence we have, but there is some evidence it's accumulating that more stress seems to shorten telomeres. So this study looked at mothers with chronically ill children, and you can see the telomere length on the vertical y-axis, the how long they have been giving care for their chronically ill child in years on the horizontal x-axis there. And you see this negative relationship. It's not a perfect relationship, certainly, but it does seem that about 20% in the variance in telomere length is due to the length of time mothers have been dealing with this very stressful thing to do in this particular study. It also seems that stress has some other sorts of unexpected, unfortunate effects on us physically. Cortisol, for example, this stress hormone that's released when we are anxious or stressed, it's helpful in small doses because it, again, gets us ready to engage in that sort of fight or flight response. But in large doses over a long period of time, cortisol seems to have lots of negative outcomes. And one in particular here, it might shrink a very important structure in your brain, the hippocampus. And that's one we've talked about as having a really important role in the formation and storage of memories. So if you look, for example, at soldiers that have on this particular graph, it's looking at how big the hippocampus is in these soldiers, and on the x-axis, it's looking at how long they were exposed to combat, and you can see the ones with a longer exposure to combat also are ones that are more likely to have PTSD. But you can see, again, this is a very small study. This is correlational evidence, but it seems like a pretty clear pattern here that the more stress you have from this, the more shrinkage we might see in hippocampal volume. So again, lots more research necessary here, but this is suggestive of even more negative effects from chronic stress than we might have thought in the past. It also seems to affect your immune system. So there's some really interesting kind of weird studies called like cold motels or viral motels, where they want to see what affects people's immune systems. And so they basically like rent out part of a hotel or use part of a hospital when that's possible, and have people allow themselves to be assigned to get a cold virus potentially. So they get all this information on these people. They have them start living in this kind of locked down place, and then they randomly assign them to either become infected with a cold virus or a placebo. So they have randomly assigned, do you have a cold or do you not have a cold? And they all give everyone the same one. Then they track that cold over a period of time, and then they see in these different studies what's going to lead to a higher likelihood people are going to catch it and have worse symptoms from it. And in this particular study, they wanted to see, is stress going to lead to people to be more likely to catch colds? And this is kind of a confusing graph in some ways, but what we're seeing here on the x-axis, these different bars, are how long someone has been dealing with a major stressor, like a divorce or losing someone, losing a job, being unemployed, these types of things. So if people have no stressor, you see that they are up at 1. They have a no stressor is kind of the baseline here. So they're at 1. Their probability is the same as themselves, essentially, to get sick. If you have a stressor that's been happening for less than a month, then you have maybe a 60% increase. It's up here at about 1.6 of a probability of a chance compared to people with no stressor. If you've been dealing with a stressor for 1 to 6 months, your chance doubles compared to someone with no stressor. It almost triples if you've been dealing with it for half a year up to 2 years. And if you've been dealing with a chronic stressor for more than 2 years, then your chance in this study of catching a cold was almost 4 times as high as someone with no stressor. So really, really stark results here that people's immune systems are just not working as well if they are stressed. Again, that's a kind of misfiring of an adaptive thing, that your immune system should not be getting as much energy if you're stressed and need to deal with some sort of immediate danger. But when it's these chronic stressors, it's continually suppressing your immune system unnecessarily, which can lead to even worse outcomes in the long run. So the kind of take-home points from this are that the stress response in general is good. It is an adaptive thing that helped us survive through our evolutionary history. It was selected for that people that had this type of stress response to deal with usually acute stressors in that environment were more likely to survive. So it was beneficial. But there's a mismatch between that tendency and our current environment where we have usually psychological stressors that are reacted to in the same way, because that's how our bodies react to stress. We shut down the slow things and we speed up our immediate reactions to things. So constantly running that stress response in our current contemporary environment, it hurts us in the long run. It doesn't necessarily help us to worry constantly about these ongoing things, and then it is damaging us. Sounds wrong, but I think it said right, physically, by having this stress response just run constantly. So what can we do about stress? What can we do to try to reduce these effects? We can engage in a lot of different things, like problem-focused coping, certain ways you can train people to engage in like problem solving rather than kind of worrying about things. We can engage in reappraisal, so thinking about how we are interpreting our physiological responses and thinking about our reactions differently. Engaging in emotion-focused coping to try to, manage our emotional reactions to things. These are all different things that might happen, especially in like a therapy setting, that people would be able to help with, how you're thinking about and feeling about stress. But I want to focus on the effects of social support for a little bit. These are things, that I mentioned previously in a synchronous session, because they were relevant then too, but I want to go through some of the same things and elaborate on them just a little bit. So social support in general is going to have some different dimensions. You might not always have all of these dimensions, but it might be emotional support, showing concern for people, showing people that they belong and you want to be around them, showing people actual types of tangible support, like giving them resources or helping them accomplish something, or even informational support just by giving somebody good advice. Now, all these things may not be necessary or wanted all the time, but these are different aspects of support that you can show people. Um, in studies that have to do with people dealing with, their cancer diagnosis, generally cancer patients report they want emotional support, but they don't always get it. Generally, if you look at longitudinal studies, people adjust better to a cancer diagnosis if they do have emotional support. But if you do studies where you are, randomly assigning people to support groups, for example, the evidence is a little bit mixed, but it does seem encouraging, maybe because the types of people that might themselves elect to go to support groups are different and might react to it differently. So there might be some people that if they really don't want it, it's not going to help. So randomly assigning them to those groups isn't helpful for them. But some studies show joining a support group can lead to people living longer, even up to a year and a half later. Um, but sometimes people might not want to get help from strangers, and it might be that because cancer treatments are improving, people need slightly different or maybe slightly less in some cases support. But one study that I talked about before it was like an archival study where they look at medical records of people with terminal illnesses, and they put them into three groups: people that wanted a volunteer hospice visitor and received it, people that requested a visitor and did not receive it, or people that did not request a visitor. And then they plot these people's probability of surviving, and you'll notice that the people that wanted a visitor and got it have a much longer survival than people that either didn't want a visitor or wanted a visitor and didn't get it. So even just getting a person coming to support you in a relatively small way one time, again, this is correlational. You're looking at things that already happened. You're not randomly assigning people to things, but this is a pretty striking finding. Another study using the kind of morbid outcome that health researchers often use, just is someone alive or not, followed 5,000 adults for 9 years. They just looked at how many social ties these people had and said, are they alive or not after 9 years? And they found a very striking finding that the more social ties you had, the longer you lived. True for men and women. And if you look at these graphs, it's showing the probability of death. So higher scores or higher bars here are worse because it's a higher probability you're not alive anymore. The white bars are the most connections, and as you move to the right in each of these age cohorts, that's fewer connections. So very consistent findings here that across all different age groups, the more connections you have, the less likely you are to die. And again, there are probably lots of things related to this, other things that people are engaging in that are correlated with the number of social ties they have, maybe separate from support, but it's still a very striking finding. So striking, it's the size of the relationship between smoking or not and death. So social support has as much impact on your survival as smoking does. In the short term, stress can also be buffered by social support. And maybe this is some of the ways that those health effects that we saw in the last couple slides are happening, that people are surviving longer because they're not experiencing stress to the same degree in these small doses. So in one study, participants debated against a tough opponent, maybe a stressful thing to do, and they either had a friend present or not. And you can see the blood pressure change here. The increase in blood pressure was much smaller when they had a supporter present than when they had no supporter present. Less than half of the blood pressure increase as when, that kind of baseline no support condition. A similar study where they had people give a 5-minute speech that they knew was going to be judged. This one didn't show quite as big of a reduction from having support, this lower red bar here. But it did show that people rebounded even faster than people that had no support. So their blood pressure increased less to start with, and then it rebounded faster. So even after a recovery period, once the stressor was gone, the people that had social support still were better off than the people that had no social support. So it seems this kind of feeds into something that I've alluded to. We call it the stress buffering hypothesis, that social support can buffer you against the negative physical effects of stress. If we have social support, stress doesn't seem to hurt us as much, and maybe it seems to prolong our lives. And this is true from different comparative psychology evidence we have. It's true for studies with rats, true for studies with monkeys, where we have observed that stress can lead to a suppressed immune system, but not if the monkeys are able to get social support from other monkeys. And of course, it's true for people. Some interesting results here where if you have rheumatoid arthritis, that might be a very stressful diagnosis leading to certain types of symptoms. But if you have social support, you have fewer of those symptoms and fewer depressive symptoms that seem to come from that sort of stressful type of diagnosis. Another interesting study, well, kind of a weird one, but they pre-screened women that were happily married and then randomly assigned them to either a control condition to hold someone's hand or to hold their husband's hand while they're getting a brain scan, and looked at how that affected, their places in the brain that we know are associated with stress. And holding anyone's hand, even a stranger, seems to help buffer the stress of being shocked in that kind of stressful sort of study. But it helped even more if it was their husband's hand. So any support helps, but support from someone that we know and trust and value time with helps too. And finally, the opposite of this is also true too. That if you're lacking social support, then you might be more likely to have these negative effects of stress. So if you have had fights with important people in your life before you are exposed to a cold virus, you might be at a higher risk of contracting that cold, but not if you have gotten hugs from people that day. So this is kind of how flexible this sort of effects of social support on stress are. That fighting might make things worse, but even getting some kind of physical contact from people might help. All right, sorry, that was a little bit of a long one, but I thought I wanted to finish all the stress stuff in one video there.